So we've talked about polygamy skepticism. We've talked about the peer review process. We've talked about my own personal adventures with polygamy skeptics. Today I'm interviewing a good friend. I knew him at Florida State when we were both grad students. I guess I was getting my PhD in American religious history and he was doing law. This is Mark Tensymeyer. Mark has studied the history of polygamy skepticism from its foundations and the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And he's going to lead us with a historical narrative from the beginning to where we are now. First became aware of Mark's work on polygamy skepticism in an article he wrote for a book by Cheryl Bruno, Secret Covenants, a book Cheryl edited for, I think it came out with Signature Books. And it's a great book, like all the things Cheryl does in her own scholarship. All right, Mark, take us away. Where does this whole thing begin?
You could say that it starts with Joseph Smith himself, because he denies that he's part of it. He denies that he's a polygamist. And really, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as presided over by Brigham Young, denies that he's a polygamist too for quite a few years. And in the same breath that they're doing it too, there's a transition where they're making less of an effort to deny it stuff in America. In places like in Europe, they're still very much adamantly denying it up until the announcement drops in August 1852. As plausible deniability was always the goal. You can see this how like people like Wilford Woodruff, how they wrote their journals. But someone whose life is as well documented as Wilford Woodruff, who was an apostle under Joseph Smith and was the fourth president of the church, a plausible deniability was always the goal.
All right, so I think this is a really good point. Joseph starts us out. Absolutely, there's denial publicly, in fact, in all factions of the Restoration that are practicing plural marriage. If you're interested in other paths of polygamy practicing and polygamy denial, you can look for Persistence of Polygamy Volume 2, or you can read an article that I wrote about all the other factions. All right, so we get started with Joseph Smith. We're moving forward, and now, of course, the next step is our RLDS origin story.
Is absolutely Joseph Smith III. And even then, it's not really until 10 years or so into his tenure as president of the RLDS Church that really becomes a thing. In a lot of ways, what we're seeing now is an extension of all the arguments that he made. And so a lot of the basic arguments about why we shouldn't think Joseph Smith is a polygamist, like I pointed out in my paper, are pretty much the same. Joseph Smith consistently denied it. His immediate family, his wife and his sons, adamantly denied it. There's very little contemporary evidence, and it doesn't seem to really jive with what you would consider authoritative, canonized revelation, canonized doctrine that was around when he was alive. There's no documented children that came from any of these polygamous unions. And so a lot of those are very similar arguments that they made. But what's really different is how you answer the question. If Joseph Smith wasn't a polygamist, then where on earth did Mormon polygamy come from? And why did so many people think that it came from him? That's the part of polygamy skepticism that's changed over the years. And how modern polygamy skeptics are making that argument is very much different. That's where the difference is. If you look at Joseph Smith's way of attacking this, he's not really sure about that. When it comes to where did polygamy come from, how did it get imputed to his father, at different points of his life, there's different ways that he goes about that. At one point, he posits the theory that sealings were done by his father, but that it didn't originate with his father. He said that certain high-ranking peoples in the church, the apostles, others, that they came up with the idea of maybe we can be sealed to somebody else for eternity. So eternity-only polygamy. And his father said, okay, yeah, that's fine. I'm going to perform this ordinance, but it'll make you happy, so we'll do it. And then it turned into like actual polygamy as we know it. He posits that theory at one point. He doesn't really stay with that, as you can see why it doesn't make a lot of sense. But what he really pushed, I think, most consistently was this idea that polygamy didn't actually start until after his father died. So you have these like John Bennett style stuff like spiritual wifery and stuff like that's happening while he's alive. And that's what he's responding to. But in terms of the actual church hierarchy, like the apostles and prominent members of the church, like the Whitneys and people like that, they're not actually doing polygamy until after he dies, not long after he dies. So the traditional RLDS narrative. So if you were a member of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the 1930s, the 1920s, the narrative you would be familiar with and what you would have grown up with is that Brigham Young instituted Mormon polygamy like in, say, around September 1840, around that time. So shortly after Joseph Smith died. And then the women were sealed to Joseph Smith posthumously in the temple. That's the first time they sealed to Joseph Smith, and they were sealed to other church leaders for life, mostly C. Kimball. And then it's later that they retroactively say that they were sealed to Joseph while he was alive. So that was really the traditional narrative.
Mark, at some point in the history of the reorganized church, they abandoned the notion that Joseph Smith was actually monogamous. Talk to me.
What happened was a lot of research was done, especially by RLDS members. An apostle of the RLDS church, the president of their church, Paul H. Hansen, incredible guy. I love his letters. You read his letters. He's a guy, I think he's attacked this whole scenario with more integrity and open-mindedness than anybody else who ever has, myself included. As you read his letters, you can tell that he deeply does not want Joseph Smith to be a polygamist. But he did so much gathering of sources outside of Utah. And they're incredible. They really are incredible. He's a bunch of them. And just how he talks to them back and forth with other historians of the RLDS church. And from what I've read from his letters and his writings, I don't know that he ever personally came to believe that Joseph Smith was not a polygamist. But what he did come to believe was that their church's position and the arguments they were using were no longer tenable, that there were questions that they didn't have answers for and that they needed to respond to it. And he didn't know what those answers were. And it's really interesting. You can read some of the back and forth he has with other letters. It's almost the same stuff that somebody like myself and Jeremy Hoop would be having, like almost the same conversations in the 1930s, like almost 100 years ago. Israel A. Smith, who was the president of their church, was a very conservative president, an amazing guy, really an amazing guy, but very conservative about how he approached this stuff. He wanted to keep a lot of this just covered before they could respond to it. And he's the one that Paul Hansen found a copy of the Expositor, like an actual copy of the Expositor. And he found a copy of the Nauvoo Neighbor where Joseph and Hiram respond to the Expositor. He found that Israel A. Smith read those that Paul Hansen found. He said he was sure that his father, Joseph Smith III, had never seen those. And so they had talked about a revelation that sounds just like Doctrine and Covenants section 132. He was sure that his father had never seen that. And so they had to start thinking of new ways to approach this. A lot of that culminates, a lot of that becomes public in the 1980s when Richard Howard comes out with this paper. And there's a whole story about that. It was supposed to come out in more of an RLDS, I don't know, like an official newspaper. And he had to modify it. Eventually it came out in the John Whitmer Journal. He gives a lot of these sources that Paul Hansen found. And so a lot of the RLDS church, at that point, the majority of RLDS church members dropped the narrative that Joseph Smith wasn't a polygamist because Paul Hansen found so many sources placing polygamy that predated Joseph Smith's death. And that's Richard and Pamela Price. They partially agree that the narrative that they had been telling for many decades was untenable. And so that's when you start getting this narrative of Brigham Young, the Quorum of the 12, are a rogue element in the church that are practicing polygamy secretly behind Joseph Smith's back. And yeah, he came out with an article that was a paid article that was put in the local newspaper in Independence. And then he had a pamphlet that came out. Richard Price put out his argument a lot more clear and consensus than I think he even did in the Joseph Smith polygamy books. He said that there was a successive 3 conspiracies. There's John Bennett, who's trying to implicate Joseph Smith in polygamy. Then there's William Law, and then there's Brigham Young after Smith. So that was in response to Richard Howard's paper, which was bringing to the forefront research that Paul Hansen and discussions that had been having internally within the RLDS leadership and with historians for decades by that point. And that's more or less the dominant narrative that we have now. There's modifications to it. The Prices are saying Joseph Smith didn't do any of it. He didn't do sealings. I think for the most part, I think that's what they're saying. Joseph Smith's public position is his only position. But then they also were the ones that started this concept of this rogue Quorum of the 12. There's Brigham Young and the 12, but they've been rogue for a while. They're the ones that start saying that they get radicalized by their contact with the Concordites in the 1830s, this radical group of people forming this point of spiritual warfare in Maine. They develop it, they experiment a little bit with it in England, and then they're practicing it to some extent or another behind Joseph Smith's back while he's alive. And then after he's dead, they take their opportunity to ingrain it into the church. And then in the Utah period, they retroactively attribute it to Joseph Smith. That's, you still see that today.
All right. This is pretty fascinating. Something happens somehow at some point. Latter-day Saints begin to start accepting this message. When? Why?
Okay. So it's around 2014, 2015 that a lot of this happens. And I'm only really privy to what I see, the effects of from the internet. I don't know what's going on that prompts that. It's things like there's a Gospel Topics essays that are coming out, Joseph Smith papers. And so a lot of the people are getting more familiar with the history of polygamy and seeing the documentation of it. Things like the Price's papers with the internet, people have more access to that type of thing. There's the beginnings of the, people call it the New Mo movement. There's things like Denver Snuffer happening.
Denver Snuffers, polygamy skeptic?
Oh yeah, he is. I wouldn't say that it's fair to say that he's really what drove the whole movement. From what I understand, there were people that are part of the movement that he's associated with that were more pro it than he was. So in his book, Passing the Heavenly Gift, that's this thing where he's trying to push back on the traditional institutional narrative of the LDS Church, is how you would say it. That doesn't include polygamy skepticism in that at all. So no, it's not. That's not really part of it. So at the time, I think it's like 2014, 2015 is when that book comes out. He did his tour, and then he has a lecture series, and then he gets excommunicated during that tour series. And then that's when he starts instigating the fellowships or instructing people to start those fellowships, and then giving instructions about how to do that. That's really when you see the movement as a semi-organized movement as we see it now. But there are people within that movement that do. So the first sign that I saw of it happening was the Joseph Smith monogamy paper that came out. And that was spread amongst those Denver Stuffer channels that were there. Leo Everett wrote it. He was anonymous at the time, and he was anonymous for quite a few years. He's since come out and taken ownership of it, along with Jeremy Hoop. He's the one that Jacob Vidrine and I debated a couple years ago. And then Denver Stuffer came out with a lecture on it and a paper on it a couple months later. And so that's really when you see it start taking root among those that were members of the church. And then during the pandemic, it took off a lot more. And yeah, here we are. And that's about when I got into it. I got into it in 2014, especially when I just started having conversations with Community of Christ and Restorationist members about this. And then all of a sudden it just had another wave. This whole movement had a third wave that happened here starting around 2015.
And I guess we've all been blessed by it ever since. Thanks for being on, Mark. I really appreciate it. I love what Mark did here, right? We have some waves. It starts with the initial denial of plural marriage in Nauvoo. This is the thing that keeps coming back with polygamy skeptics, right? We're standing up for Joseph's voice. We're monogamy affirmers. On the surface, I really like that. Other than the fact, I think it's obvious Joseph's denials are based on the fact that he doesn't want to reap persecution on himself or the saints. We've been in Missouri. We're in Nauvoo. His martyrdom is about to happen. And after that first moment of denial, we then have Latter-day Saints openly practicing plural marriage. And a second wave of denial moves in the wake of Joseph Smith III's leadership over the reorganized church. Remember, the first position they had about plural marriage was actually that Joseph Smith intended to repent of plural marriage, that he did introduce it, but recognized it was a flaw that was going to harm the church and wanted to get rid of it at the time of his death. Very different models. The RLDS model then gets questioned in the 1970s and 80s, leading to the restorationist response by Richard Price and others that doubled down on that earlier moment. And then finally, this modern post-2015 introduction to these ideas within Latter-day Saint communities. Mark, thanks for being on. I hope this is helpful. I will see you guys tonight at 7 p.m. if you want. I'm dropping the video live. Remember, all of these have a timeline on it. 132 hours. That gives you a few days